Well, welcome back for us up here, and thank you for continuing to join us. I realise at the last session I forgot to introduce myself. I'm not assuming that everyone knows who I am, so I will introduce myself now. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Melinda Salento, the CEO of CEDA, the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. Just a quick update on this session, which is about our defence funding and capability, risks and opportunities. If you're glancing up on the stage, you will notice that one of the participants who was in the program, the Minister, is not on stage. Minister Dutton has sent his late apologies, and so I've spent the last 2 minutes shredding my speaking notes and questions. And in the spirit of the agility of the last 18 months, we are going to progress with a slightly reshaped conversation, but nonetheless, I think a really interesting one. I did want to say that in the absence of the Minister participating in this conversation, there really isn't anyone up here who speaks on behalf of the government, and so we won't be looking to sort of become a de facto minister. So questions on the government's policy per se are really not for me. I certainly have no expertise, and not for the panel. So we're going to reshape the conversation, give you some nonetheless super interesting perspectives based on the 2-minute conversation I just had with all of the panellists. And let me start by also introducing and thanking a late ring-in for our discussion, Craig Lockhart, who is on my immediate right, who is the Managing Director at Maritime Australia. Thank you so much for filling in at short notice. On his right is Sam Roggeveen, I've got that? Roggeveen, sorry Sam, who's the Director of the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute. And then at the end of the table is Gabby Costigan, who is the CEO of BAE Systems. We thought what we would do is actually ask Sam to lead off the conversation by painting a little bit of a picture, if you like, around what the outlook in the region is, how that's changed, and also what the sort of community attitudes and perceptions are around defence security in the region, and how that may have evolved in the most recent time. So Sam, over to you, then we're just going to segue into a bit of a conversation around our own sovereign capability, defence industry. Where are the opportunities, where are the threats, and specifically talk a bit about technology and what that means for us. So Sam, over to you to sort of get us started, and then we'll talk a bit more about the industry per se. I've asked the panellists to drive this conversation perhaps a little bit harder, given I am not an expert. As always, please, questions if you have them, and we will have questions from the room as well. So with that, thanks, Sam.
Thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for being here and for tuning in. Look, I guess the best way to start as a strategic commentator is that my baseline judgment, and I think shared by most people who comment on defence and strategic issues in Australia, is that our security environment is deteriorating. And I think actually the poll results that the Lowy Institute released yesterday reinforce that actually Australians agree with that as well. And you can see in particular increasing, really dramatically increased scepticism around China and China's place on the world stage. All that poll report is available on the Lowy Institute's website. So the baseline strategic judgment here is that Australia's security environment is deteriorating. Now, that's not in itself reason for panic. We're not Israel. We're not South Korea, where the enemy's sort of on the doorstep, and you've got two countries or two sides on hair trigger alert with war effectively due to start at any moment. But on the other hand, we may not be Israel, we may not be South Korea, but we're not Canada either, we're not Iceland, we're not New Zealand, we're somewhere in between, and gradually we are rising up that international scale. So then why is our strategic environment deteriorating? Well, I think for most commentators, that judgment is made largely, maybe almost entirely, on the basis of the rise of China, and that's certainly a critical factor. I'll speak about that very briefly, but I also want to talk about two other reasons why I think Australia's strategic environment is deteriorating. On China, firstly, I think we have to be realistic and say that purely as a military power, and it's grown significantly in recent decades, even the Soviet Union at its peak as a military power had very little capability to use force against Australia. That is with the important exception, of course, of nuclear weapons. China today already has more non-nuclear capability to strike the Australian continent than the Soviet Union ever did. And there is much more to come. There's no reason to think that the rise of China as a military power, as a strategic power, has plateaued. Its military capabilities are still growing rapidly. Now, you might ask, why does any of this matter? China's not our enemy. China is Australia's most important trading partner, after all, and China's never going to invade Australia, even if China ever had the capability to do that, which it isn't anywhere near to having. There's no good reason to ever try anything like that, so I've never thought, and again, most strategic commentators would share this judgment, that's not a serious military contingency that we should be planning for. But although China's not an enemy, it's clearly not an ally either, and it does have security interests and ambitions that clash with ours. So that in itself was an important shift for our strategic circumstances, and not for the better. The key thing here is the power of any country, China in this case, but really any country, to coerce Australia. So if China were to threaten the use of force against Australia, would we take that threat seriously? Does it actually have the capability to make good on those kind of threats? And increasingly the answer is yes. And so that means that the very existence of that kind of military power can have coercive potential when, cabinet ministers are sitting around a table making important decisions about our foreign affairs. So what we want to avoid is being in a situation where we can be coerced in that way, where the potential use of military power against Australia exercises a kind of a pressure on Australia that we feel we can't resist. So that's the first reason why I think Australia's strategic circumstances are deteriorating, is simply the rise of China's military power, even though it is not an enemy, and I want to stress that. There's a second reason, though, and this, if you call that a first-order effect of China's growth as a military power, then there's also an important, maybe even more important effect, which is second order, creates a major complication for Australia, and that is that China's rise makes life much, much harder for our great ally, the United States. What I don't mean to argue is that America is in decline. I think that argument's been overstated. America's economy and its military and its demographic strengths over the long term are deep, and so America will remain a major world power for the indefinite future. So my argument here is really not about American power, it's about American resolve. During the Cold War, the United States made a series of promises to allies in our region, including Australia, but because of China's rise, the cost of keeping those promises is getting higher, and I would argue the incentive to the United States for keeping those promises is actually going down. Taiwan, briefly, is one excellent example. It's a sort of stark example of this trend. 20 years ago, it was easy for the United States to declare that it would meet its obligations to Taiwan because China at that time posed no real threat to Taiwan. But the military balance has shifted pretty radically since then. So we have to ask ourselves, and of course allies like Australia do ask, and like Taiwan do ask themselves this question, would the US really be willing to risk a war with China? A war that it might lose, or at the very least, which would result in the sinking of, let's say, a couple of aircraft carriers, the bombing of its bases in Japan and Guam. That's a lot to ask for the United States, given that Taiwan itself is not essential for US security. In fact, the US actually is one of the most secure nations on earth. It's surrounded by two big oceans, east and west, by friendly neighbours, north and south. What pressing reason is there for the US to maintain that kind of defence guarantee to Taiwan, or indeed to any Asian ally? China, after all, is not a military threat to the US. America can defend itself territorially quite comfortably. China's not an ideological threat either. It doesn't want to lead a kind of global revolution in the way the Soviet Union did in the 1950s and 60s. Nor is there any real reason to think that China would or could lock the US out of Asia economically, even if the US was a much weaker relative military power in Asia. And for all its size, China is also surrounded by other great powers that are capable of keeping Beijing's ambitions in check. So, as I said, the cost to America of keeping its promises is rising, while the incentives for doing that are declining. That's not a rosy long-term picture for Australia. It means we'll have to do more of the heavy lifting ourselves when it comes to defence and foreign policy. The third reason that I think Australia's strategic circumstances are eroding, and I'll close on this point very quickly, and that's Indonesia. Indonesia is still a relatively weak state, but some projections say that it will have a bigger economy than Japan by 2050, and by that stage it may have found the means and the will to become a true leader in Southeast Asia. And if that happens, then for the first time ever, Australia will have a great power on its doorstep. That is a major change for Australia. In fact, I'd argue that's a more significant challenge for Australian security, even than the rise of China. And again, Indonesia is not an enemy. In fact, we've got all the reason in the world, more reason than ever, to try to enhance our relationship with Indonesia and make it closer than ever before, because we do face a common challenge actually through the rise of China. So I think there's more urgency than ever before to get our relationship with Indonesia right, for economic and for strategic reasons. You know, with the objective in mind, I think, of being on the right path with a country that is due to be, as I said, a major world power by the middle of this century. I'll close on that point.
Thanks, Sam. There's a bunch of things I'm going to come back to you on there, but I think one of the things I'd promised to mention in my opening comments, and then of course had a brain fade, but I think one of the interesting sort of pieces of sort of contextual sort of background, if you like, for me for this conversation was, you know, I spent a bit of time in boardrooms and talking to business leaders, and it's been really interesting to hear them talking a lot more about these issues than I think I've probably heard in the past. And I think, you know, some of the developments, you know, even just things that have been happening in Hong Kong, and the sort of response there, I just think has been a bit of a moment of pause, and it's just been fascinating. And I guess the supply chain issues we heard just in the previous session, Ian talking about, you know, shipping. I think it's, you know, the combination of you know, some of the circumstances we've seen in China, Hong Kong, some of the other realities of our trading relationships have actually kind of shifted the dial a little bit in the minds of business. And it is being talked about more front and centre. You talked in your comments, Sam, about our capability, and so let me look to you, Gabby, and to bring you in here, because, you know, I think it's one of the things that perhaps people are now kind of going, I don't really know enough about this, or I don't really have a perspective on what our capabilities are or what they should be, or how we think about our own defence sector. So perhaps over to you for some opening comments, and we'll dig into that a little bit more with Craig as well.
Yeah, sure. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Great to be here. So Craig and I both represent BAE Systems Australia, which is one of the leading defence companies in our nation. And we have the privilege of providing defence capability to the Australian Defence Force and other agencies. So Melinda, I guess, and Sam, to follow on from your comments, you know, you really sort of painted the picture there about what's happening in the region, the strategic environment, you know, and by saying that it is a deteriorating environment, well, you know, from my perspective, defence industry now has an even more important role in the future. So our government is investing $270 billion in the next decade to recapitalise, you know, the Australian Defence Force. So, you know, these big investments that are being made to ensure that we have world-class technology and capability to protect our nation and our national interests. You know, so we're obviously a very big supporter of that. You know, and I think, you know, you're right, defence is being talked about now a lot more. And I think, you know, the Australian population is wanting to understand more about defence industry. I think for a long time defence industry was really in the shadows, and I don't think there was a very clear understanding of the real sovereign capability that we have in this country. And I think in the last 12 to 18 months, with what we've all experienced with the global pandemic, we now realise probably more than ever, because of the challenges that we do face with international and global supply chains, that we have to build this resilience within our own country. You know, so that's an incredibly important thing for defence industry. And one of the things that we really now need to do is to be able to demonstrate that we do have that capability here resident in our nation, that we do have to build an industry that is competitive internationally, that is innovative, you know, because we want to be able to, you know, protect ourselves and our national interests, as I said before.
So let me just ask a follow-up question around that, because and this is going to perhaps highlight my my lack of detailed sort of understanding. But how do we think about building that that innovative capability? And is it partnerships with? I mean, if I think innovation, I go partnerships with universities. But how do we do that?
Yeah, look, it's a combination, I think, of all those things. You know, I think number one, first, you've got to understand what we've actually got here, right? And I think there is, you know, a lack of education or depth, really, in the community's understanding of some of the great technologies that are actually been developed here in our country. And not just in defence industry, but across multiple industries in Australia. So I think there's certainly work to be done, you know, certainly working with academia, working with defence science and technology, with industry, but it's also investing and growing that SME community in Australia. You know, that's where the innovation sits. So, you know, we need primes like BAE Systems Australia to be able to work closely, you know, with some of these smaller and medium-sized enterprises to help understand what their capabilities are, what they've developed, and how we can work together to ensure that we can bring forth the capability, you know, for our Australian Defence Force to be able to do their job.
I'm going to come back to you on an interesting question around the appetite for that in Australia, if I could put it that way. But
I would say it's huge.
Craig, let me bring you into the conversation and, you know, ask for your perspectives on capability, and you can speak perhaps directly to your project, if you like, and I put it that way.
Yes, it's a big project.
It is a big project.
Yes, thank you. We have two objectives really within the Hunter programme. One is to deliver the 9 ASW frigates for this government, but the other objective of equal importance is to deliver those elements of sovereign capability throughout the journey, because Hunter in itself is a 20 to 30 year journey. So we've got to look at those capabilities that are here today, that we can kind of exploit, you know, into the Hunter programme, but the capabilities that are also not here, and how can we work with companies, whether they be overseas or elsewhere, to, you know, look at Australia as an investable market, bring that knowledge here, and work with universities to try and, you know, what I would call future-proof those technologies. A good example is that the first ship will be different to the last ship. We're building for, but not with, in many aspects. We have to look at what the threat environment might be in 30 years' time, and make sure that the platforms that roll out the Osborne shipyard are capable of adopting those new technologies that might not even be thought about yet. But, you know, in future, everything from the stealth signature of the ship, to its surveillance capability, to its strike capability, you know, to its mission systems control. In 30 years' time, the frigate may be more of a mothership that's, you know, commanding UAVs, UUVs. You know, we have to build the technology and the software and the control systems that allows us to develop and go through that journey. So we are seeing, you know, an incredible appetite in Australia for that capability to be developed. And we're encouraging the SME community to bring forward the things that they are working on, often for other sectors, so that we can harness that technology, marinise it, and make sure, you know, we understand what it's capable of doing, and therefore adopt that into the Hunter programme. The challenge that I have is managing the balanced programme. You know, Navy will want the ships early. You know, as we are hearing, you know, our defence postural threat is changing. It's very dynamic. there's always a balance about providing that capability much earlier, providing it at a level that it can deliver the effective capability that we want. It's not just, a ship that we have to deliver early. We have to make sure that when it gets out to operational requirement, it can be that effective platform. So my job is to balance the schedule, the cost, and the need, and often the ambition to do that much quicker, much cheaper.
Absolutely. I think anyone who's managed big projects understands that. A question to both of you, really, and to sort of flesh out my sort of comment, Gabby, around what the appetite is. One of the areas of work that CEDA's very involved in is this topic called public interest technology, which is around really thinking about the governance of technology and sort of tech for good. And over in the US, the Harvard Kennedy School has a program called Technology and Public Purpose, which is similar. And it's been kicked off by, or led by a person by the name of Ash Carter, who used to be a defence secretary in the US. And I've listened to him a couple of times talk about the sort of pushback, if you like, around investment in defence technology, and it sort of sits in that kind of ethical investment space, if I can put it that way, and a perception that we shouldn't really be investing in this, and is this an area of priority? Now, I think that sentiment's shifted a bit because of the issues that Sam sort of drew attention to. But I'm just interested in your perspective on that, and whether you do find that there are some who just actually don't want to be involved in the tech space there, and whether there are particular areas that are more or less challenging, and how you frame that up in terms of the opportunities here in Australia.
Yes, I would say that there are certainly people out there who do have a view around defence industry and the technology and capability that we provide, and don't want to be involved in the development of that in the future. Our job, as I said before, is to make sure that we provide the capability and technology to our customer, the Australian Defence Force, so that they can do their job. And their job ultimately is to protect our nation. So the technology that we develop, is clearly, and the capabilities that we provide, is there to do a job which is about protection. I guess primarily. But many of the technologies that we are working on in defence industry have application outside of our industry. And that is where I think there's significant opportunity for our nation, particularly from an export perspective. And you can look back through history now where there's been some great innovations that have come from defence that are now used in other areas. The GPS is one example. Duct tape is another. Right? So there's some really, I think some good innovations, and they're the things that we need to be looking at now. Technology, I think for us, there's both a risk and opportunity for us in the development of technology in the future, and it's a fine balance for us. And I think, again, one of the challenges that we face now around some of those disruptive technologies, particularly, are the threats that we face from a cyber perspective. So one of the things that Defence has got to do is build that resilience in all the capabilities that we provide to ensure that we are able to protect as well those capabilities. So, and again, these are things that can be applied across multiple industries. So I think, there's a lot of appetite out there, I think, for other industries to understand what we're doing. Craig mentioned before some of the unmanned vehicles and things that are being worked on in defence industry at the moment, and opportunities again for the future. So those autonomous technologies, that's not just a defence space, right? The autonomous technologies are used in the oil and gas industry, in the mining industry. So it's harnessing the development of the capabilities and technologies, and then being able to see how can we use them broader than just defence industry. And what are the opportunities for us to potentially export them as well?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I should say that, in response to some of this questioning, Ash Carter's sort of commentary is around, well, why wouldn't you want, one, in defence of the nation, and with very critical technologies that can be used for good and for bad in many instances, why wouldn't you want the very best and brightest people working on them as a number one priority? And why wouldn't you want the very people that bring, the thinking around safe, sustainable, ethical, all the rest of it, sort of front and centre? So it's just it's an interesting challenge. And to your point, if you go and have a look at, I mean, you mentioned GPS. Later on today, we'll hear from Mariana Mazzucato, and one of the things that she likes to remind people is that a lot of the underlying technology that actually makes iPhones as fantastic as they are all technologies that were actually built on the back of government-funded R&D, and particularly in the defence industry. So not just GPS, but touchscreens as well. Perhaps a question to both of you around, how are you looking to build those relationships and to think about how you can, extend the application of those technologies or use ideas from other sectors or other thinking to bring back into your businesses?
Yeah.
Go for it.
Want to go?
I think, Melinda, I think that's a really good question. One way we're doing it within the Hunter programme in the maritime domain is in South Australia. We've set up something called Line Zero, which is the factory of the future. We've provided a marinised environment, a shipbuild environment, whereby we're working with the universities on research technologies, but we've encouraged the SME community to come and test their products, their systems, their applications in our environment, whereby we get first-hand knowledge of what they're able to bring to our sector, and by working with them we can determine or explain our need and statement in a defence environment also. And I think that's where we're continually cycling through companies to allow them to bring into that research environment, and then for us to work with them to take their products and capabilities to the next level. It's a benefit of two minds in two ways, whereby we get to see within the market and the commercial space what technologies are appropriate for us, but equally we get to help the SME community and that sovereign capability generation by pointing them in a direction that looking forward that 40-year horizon, the kind of things that our threat environment might be asked to consider. I think cyber was one that Gabby touched on. Many people think about cyber as they see it and read it in the news, but it was largely came out of the defence environment, where it was our ability to protect our own information.
Yeah.
Defence assets move terabytes of information. We need to have an ability to protect that, but what we're seeing now is that knowledge, that expertise being used much more in the wider industrial space. We could pick up the newspapers on a daily basis and find companies that are being attacked, held on ransomware. And I think defence has a big part to play as an industry who has a big experience in that arena and can help the wider kind of industrial base learn from the things that we have learned because we've developed it for a different need.
Yeah. Sam, I'm going to bring you back into the conversation, and I promised I had a question for you based on your opening comments. What do you make of, I mean, we've seen the Prime Minister, you talked about us as a nation having to become a little bit more self-reliant in the future. We've seen the Prime Minister over with the G7, and there was a real sense, I think, of, at least in terms of how the media reported it, of the G7 getting behind Australia in the conversation around China and supporting the stance that Australia is taking and the rhetoric and everything else. How important do you see that sort of relationship? And if you look at Indonesia, I mean, what are the relationships that we should be building? Are we still putting too much emphasis on today's strategic partners? Should we be putting more on the future partners? How do you see that?
Very much agree with that, with where you finished, yes. So I actually wrote an opinion piece in the Sydney Morning Herald after the G7 and NATO summits, where you're right, our media was full of commentary about how they were echoing the Prime Minister's comments, and that they had our back and they were all focused on China the way we are. I would argue, don't hold your breath. The rhetoric may be lovely and helpful to a limited degree, but our traditional partners don't share our security concerns exactly to the degree that we need to be able to rely on them in a security emergency. So I already, I already made the argument about the United States and that its resolve to maintain its leadership status and its protection, its defence of its allies in Asia, that resolve is actually eroding. And I do think that process will continue over the long term. That's even more the case when we come to traditional partners in Europe and in the UK. I mean, their interest, their security is simply not threatened at the moment to a high enough degree by China's rise that they would make any kind of major commitments to Australia. So I would argue that we do need to look to new partners, yes. And the country that shares our interests the most, and that importantly shares our strategic geography, is Indonesia. And it's also, as I said earlier, a major power in the making. So there is an urgent job there for Australia and Indonesia, I would argue, to enter into a new relationship that ensures that our maritime Southeast Asia remains free and open. And I think Indonesia is the obvious partner for a relationship like that, because it does share our geography, and it ought to share the same concerns that we have about a future in which Asia generally, but particularly Southeast Asia, is dominated by China. I think it's inevitable that China will be the strongest power, and we can't resist that. But what we can resist is that China becomes the dominant power. That is certainly well within our grasp. And actually the Minister, Mr. Dutton, made some comments on Sky News this morning, which I saw made some headlines. He talked about the idea that if an adversary, he didn't name any names, but if an adversary challenged Australia militarily, that there would be a very high price to pay. And I think that's kind of bracing language, and that's different language than we've heard before from an Australian government, because these are new circumstances, and we have been on a bit of a strategic holiday for the last few decades, but we're becoming a more normal nation in that regard, a nation that does have security threats that it needs to worry about, which I spoke about earlier. And I think the idea of an adversary having a price to pay, as the Minister put it, that is the right kind of framing. We're not big enough that we're ever going to defeat a major power, but we are big enough, and we are strong enough, and we're smart enough to put ourselves in a position where any adversary has to say to themselves, well, we could try this, but if we did, the costs to us are going to be very high. We might win eventually, but at what cost? That's the kind of calculation that Australia, as a medium-sized power, has to put into the minds of any potential adversary. So that framing is, I think, exactly right. It's not about winning, but it's about making the other guy pay too high a price to even bother to make threats against Australia.
Thanks. I'm going to see if there's questions from the room. We've got a question at the front. Thank you. We won't be a moment. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, where you're from. Thanks.
Thank you. My name's Ben Packham. I'm a journalist with the Australian newspaper. I'd like to ask Gabby and perhaps Craig about their ship, the Hunter-class frigate. We've heard that this ship has some weight problems, and that it's very close to the margins for sort of future. To add future capabilities on over time. I'm hoping you could tell me how heavy is the ship, and what that margin is, and how much of it needs to be redesigned from the original reference ship, the Type 26, to fulfil the requirements of the client.
Want me to take that one?
You can take that one.
Well, I think there was three or
I'm
four,
really glad
three or
that
four
that
questions.
question wasn't directed to me.
Yeah, 3 or 4 questions on that one. Let me answer them in reverse. I think as far as the global combat ship, this is in the Australian class of 9 is one of 32 ships being currently procured and built by UK, Canada and Australia. Our version of the Type 26 reference ship is the same in propulsion terms. So everything below the main deck is common for each three nations. So that means from the hull, ship systems, propulsion systems is the same. The Australianisation part of our ship is everything above the main deck. So in effect, the radar, it's avionics, we've got different helicopters, so therefore it requires a different structure modification to do that. The combat system is different to the UK. The UK is buying a UK combat system. The Canadians are using LM Canada combat system. We are using the Aegis Baseline 9 US system with a Saab-derived Australian interface. So everything that you see above the waterline in terms of weaponry combat systems is the Australian component of it. And that means that there's a significant design effort going in to make sure that we can integrate the capabilities that Australia requires within the whole ship, and to keep that ship within the key performance characteristics: range, speed, noise, interoperability, all those things, acceleration, endurance. And as we go through the design stages, which 2021 is very much about the design this year, we have to make sure that every capability that we're being asked to change away from the reference ship can still be accommodated within those whole ship design parameters. So those are the design thresholds that we work in. Yes, the Australian ship is heavier than the UK ship, but there's good reasons of why that is the case. Our combat system, our radar, our change in avionics structure is driving kind of more weight into our program. So therefore, we can accommodate that. The ship is 8,200 tons, light ship estimate, and we see nothing within the changes that we're currently agreeing with the Commonwealth that will move us away from that. So it's still well within the design parameters, and every major change that we consider, we assess against those key performance characteristics. I would be firing my naval architects if that wasn't the case. But when it comes to making sure that we have the capability, we'll go through 2021 in particular and make sure we stabilise the big functional requirements of the main design components. We want to establish that clearly before we get close to manufacture. We can't get into manufacture and still not have the design agreed between us. But, as we've went through the journey for the last few years, yes, we are being asked to make changes in that the Australianisation part. The combat system is being continually assessed based on a new threat environment. We're continually being asked to consider, changes to the platform, and that's just part of shipbuilding. That's what we do, is to make sure that we could still deliver the Australian government a capable ship, but is still within schedule and still within the cost environment. And that's the complexity of kind of what we live within. But we have no issues with what we see at the moment. We're still within well weight. The margin, we assess the margin on a through life capability. So the Australian government and the Royal Australian Navy needs the ability to continually upgrade the ship through life. And for the non-naval architects, ships carry weight through life, so they get heavier. And that's
as
largely,
do we all.
Yeah, it's a bit like aging. We all get a bit heavier, a bit more sturdy. Ships are no different. They will carry weight. So that weight is projected within the initial design. We measure the through-life growth in years, and we generate an equivalent year's worth of through-life growth. We are still, as planned, and with all the design changes that we are currently assessing, still well within that in-service weight growth margin, which is giving that Royal Australian Navy the ability to continually upgrade the platform.
Gabby, I'm going to ask you a question. You talked about opportunities for SMEs. Is there more that needs to be done to connect more SMEs to the defence sector opportunities? And a related question, I guess, to both of you is, one of the things that we're hearing a lot about at CEDA at the moment is the impact of closed borders on migration, obviously, and skilled shortages. So, and I guess that's the link to capability, but what's your thinking?
Look, I would say there's always more that we can do to link the SME community to some of the larger opportunities within defence. But I do think that we're doing a pretty good job right now. As I said earlier, the $270 billion worth of investment in capability is providing just such an enormous opportunity for Australian businesses. within defence industry, those programs that companies want to be a part of, take it the Hunter program that Craig was just talking about, we have a number of networks and things that people can register themselves on and demonstrate their interest and tell us about their capabilities and technologies. We do so many different roadshows across the nation, trying to communicate and say what are the opportunities that are out there for SMEs. But you've got to remember, companies like ours, we've been doing this in Australia for 70 years. So we've already got very robust Australian supply chains in place now. In fact, we've got more than 1,600 Australian suppliers that we're currently using. And I think on Craig's program, they've got registered now another 1,500 Australian companies who have shown a desire to have, their products or expertise used on the platform. Can we do more? Yes, we can always do more.
Sorry, let me just jump in. There was a question too, not just about what BAE can do, but increasingly when you look at approaches to try to grow that sort of capability, it's a more of an ecosystem approach, and there are other levers and other forms of support, government supported, whether it's finance, whether it's capability build, whether it's
and that's happening.
Yeah.
That is happening now. So it is an ecosystem, right? So Craig mentioned to you before an example of Line Zero in South Australia, which is a joint effort from both government support, state government support, academia, a big prime like BAE Systems, and multiple SMEs who are working together, in an environment to collaborate and test, and do things so that we can continue to evolve and innovate, for defence industry. So that collaboration is happening. What else is happening as well is we're working with other departments like the Education Department. 60% of my workforce are STEM qualified roles, right? So it's great to be able to have the technology, but I also need to develop the people and the workforce here. And one of the challenges that we face is in some of the critical skills areas is how do we continue to develop those pipelines of people coming up through Australia. We have been impacted certainly by losing some of the international students that we've had in Australia, but we've got the capability here, we've got the people here. We've just got to make sure that, number one, we're getting them to study the right things. So that's a constant work in process for us, and we do that, again, very collaboratively, both with state governments, with the federal government, and with, multiple levels of academia. So, I think we're getting there.
I think on the resource front, I was with Minister Price this morning, representing the shipbuilding CEOs. We are extremely nervous about the people capability to meet that sovereign response. I think one thing that the pandemic has given us is the lack of foreign students in our universities. Yep. That might not seem, that relevant, but when, we're seeing growth in the mineral sector and infrastructure sector, then, those adjacent sectors are using the same pool that we would have traditionally ring-fenced as our defence-capable people. And without a national level response to this, we will be critically short. Within the next 5 years between submarines and warships, there's 15,000 direct new positions required. And we've estimated that there's a multiple of 3 to 4 required in the supply chain. And that's a huge amount of people that we have to find. And if we continue to deliver a state-based response, which is in competition, with our universities and our TAFEs and other things, then I think we'll find that resource is not there or capable when we require it. We've got to double our efforts to get more in the resource hopper for us to be able to kind of draw from that.
We've also got to be smarter within defence industry as well. Craig talked about competing industries now for some of the critical skill sets. Well, when you've got $270 billion worth of acquisition programs all happening at the same time, we're all trying, to get these very capable and skilled engineers. So we're almost all fishing from the same pool at the moment. So there is a challenge in managing that, and there's a challenge with defence industry being respectful of each other's boundaries as well on how we establish these niche skill sets and capabilities to be able to ensure that we can continue to deliver on our commitments, right? So that's a real challenge for us right now, but it is certainly recognised, I would say, by the government, and they are doing what they can to help support us from a federal perspective. Yeah.
Sam, you look keen to interject here.
I just want to say that immigration is a strategic issue for Australia. So one of the things that the rise of China and of Asian nations generally, the economic rise of Asia has demonstrated, is that it's established this direct connection between population size and strategic weight. So when you've got a strong economy, if you've got lots of people, that means you're going to be that means you're going to be that much stronger as a global power, as a military and strategic power. That's certainly true of China. It's becoming more and more true of India, even countries like Vietnam, and in future Indonesia, it's going to be true of them as well. So there is a direct, I think, correlation and causation between Australia's population size and its strategic weight. To have the kind of future that I talked about early on, where Australia in relative terms is becoming less powerful compared to its neighbours, a high immigration program and a much bigger population for Australia is a strategic consideration for us, not just in terms of defence industry, but of having the kind of the economic and the defence capabilities to ensure our security.
So let me ask a follow-up question, because it's one that's come through the app, which is about one of the things that we talk a lot about in Australia, I think, is that is the diaspora and the fact that people who've come and studied here and gone home, the relationship that builds. How is that important in terms of our sort of strategic security thinking, and the fact that there's a bunch of students who've come back, they've gone back to countries like China, like Indonesia, Malaysia, India. Does that feature, or are we just trying to kid ourselves on that?
Well, I mean, I think one of the great prices that we've paid probably since 9/11 is that the national debate about immigration and about border control has become overly securitised. And I picked 9/11, but also Tampa, of course, happened around the same time, and the whole boats issue after that, which really has transformed the political culture of both of our major parties, and has led to this, I would argue, over-securitisation of the border and of immigration issues. And so I do think there's something to be said for thinking about immigration and foreign diasporas as a major foreign policy asset for Australia. And in fact, to think about immigration as a tool of foreign policy. We've done this before. For instance, after Tiananmen Square, the Hawke government at the time, made a major announcement about allowing Chinese students to stay in Australia. Of course, we have the Pacific Island seasonal worker scheme, and more recently an announcement about Southeast Asian seasonal workers. So we do use immigration as a foreign policy tool, and I think actually there's a case for doing that. Again, and doing it to an even greater extent. And to bring it back to a point I made earlier about Indonesia, the Indonesian diaspora in Australia is tiny compared to how important Indonesia actually is to Australia in our future as a strategic partner. It would be great, actually, if we had some favourable access to Indonesians, so that we do build a diaspora that is kind of a bridge between our two countries and builds that ballast that we need for a much enhanced strategic partnership with Indonesia.
Well, I'm conscious that lunch is upon us, so I might finish the session on there. I think it's a really great point, but let me take the opportunity firstly to thank Craig for stepping in at short notice. Sam, Gabby, thank you for your insights We did ask a poll question, and you might have been a little bit surprised because it wasn't really related to defence, but we took the opportunity to ask about another form of resilience, which was what has been your organisation's greatest challenge through COVID? 37% said supply chain resilience and disruption, 37% said customer and stakeholder engagement, and about 27% talked about productivity as a result of remote working. None of you are grappling with increased costs, so maybe that's still to come. But could you please join me in thanking the panel? We'll have lunch and then we'll be back after lunch for more interesting conversations. Thank you so much.